The town of Redstone Flats had a way of chewing people up and spitting them out into the dust like tobacco juice, slow, ugly, and without a single apology. Most folks who passed through didn't stay long enough to learn its rhythms. But if you stayed, if you were unlucky enough or poor enough or broken enough to call it home, you'd learn one thing real fast. In Redstone Flats, there were two kinds of people. Those who owned something, and those who were owned. Clara Whitmore was the second kind, though nobody ever said it out loud. She was a widow, 26 years old, with copper hair that the desert sun had kissed into something almost golden, and eyes the color of a storm rolling in off the eastern plains. She ran a small laundry house at the edge of town, scrubbing other people's dirt from sunup to sundown. And every evening she walked home through the same cracked alleyway between the feed store and the blacksmith. And every evening, for reasons the town pretended not to notice, she didn't always walk out of it standing straight. His name was Dale Cutter. He was the brother of her dead husband, a man who believed that when a man dies, everything he owned passes to his blood, including the woman. Nobody stopped him. The sheriff looked the other way. The preacher called it a private matter. The good citizens of Redstone Flats closed their shutters and told themselves it wasn't their business. All except one man. He sat at the window of the Dust Horn Hotel every single evening, watching. His name was Elias Cord, and he was the richest man within 200 miles. People wondered why a man like that hadn't done a single thing to help her. They were about to find out that he had been doing something. They just couldn't see it yet. And neither could Clara. Elias Cord had arrived in Redstone Flats on a Tuesday in late September, riding a black horse that made every other animal on the street look tired and underfed by comparison. He carried no rifle visibly strapped to his saddle, which was unusual for a man traveling alone through open country. What he did carry was a leather satchel, a dark coat that had probably cost more than most men in town earned in a year, and a stillness about him, a particular kind of quiet that wasn't peaceful. It was the quiet of a man who had already calculated every exit in the room before he walked through the door. He took the best room in the Dust Horn Hotel, paid 3 months in advance in hard cash without blinking, and from that first evening, he sat in the chair beside the window overlooking the main street, and watched. The town assumed he was a land speculator, or a railroad man, or maybe someone on the run from something far away and complicated. In the Wild West, men who paid in cash and said little were either dangerous or desperate, and Elias Cord looked like neither. He simply looked deliberate. His face was angular, high cheekbones, a jaw that carried old scar tissue along the left side, dark eyes that absorbed everything around them without giving much back. He was perhaps 35, perhaps older. Hardship had a way of making age ambiguous in men who had lived real lives. His hands, when he set them on the windowsill, were not the soft hands of an idle rich man. They were scarred and capable. He had money, that much was obvious. But the money hadn't made him soft. On the third evening of his stay, he saw Clara Whitmore. She was crossing the street with a bundle of folded laundry balanced in her arms, moving quickly the way people move when they're trying not to be noticed. She had her head slightly down, chin tucked, as if making herself smaller was a habit she'd practiced so long it had become instinct. She was beautiful in a way she probably didn't know anymore, the kind of beauty that exhaustion and fear can almost, but not quite, extinguish. And then Dale Cutter stepped out from the alley beside the feed store. He was a large man, thick through the chest and shoulders, with a broad, flat face that might have been handsome once before cruelty settled into the lines of it permanently. He wore a rancher's clothes, expensive, well-kept, because the Cutter family ran the biggest cattle operation east of the river, and Dale wore that fact on him like armor. He said something to Clara that Elias couldn't hear from the window. She stopped. Her shoulders went rigid. She responded without looking up, and whatever she said clearly wasn't what Dale wanted to hear, because his right hand moved fast, not a full strike. More of a shove against her shoulder, and the laundry tumbled into the dust. Clara bent to collect it without a word. Dale stood over her, speaking down at the back of her head. Then he walked away. She knelt in the dirt of the main street of Redstone Flats and gathered other people's clean clothing from the ground while a dozen townsfolk found reasons to look elsewhere. Elias Cord sat absolutely still at his window and watched the whole thing. He did not come down. He did not shout from the window. He reached into the leather satchel beside his chair and withdrew a small journal, worn leather, pages thick with ink, and he wrote something in it. Several lines. Slowly and deliberately, the way a man writes something he intends to remember. Then he set the journal down and resumed watching. An older woman named Mrs. Beaumont, who brought Elias his evening coffee each night, saw him sitting there after it happened and clicked her tongue. "Terrible thing," she said, setting the cup on the side table. "Poor Clara. Been going on since her husband passed last spring." "How long ago was that?" Elias asked, without turning from the window. 6 months. Thomas Whitmore, Dale's younger brother. Good man Thomas was. Caught fever on the cattle drive and didn't come home. She paused. Dale's had it in his head ever since that Clara owes him something. Says she lived off Cutter money, so she belongs to the Cutter name. Sheriff Harlan won't touch it because Dale's father built this town. Elias was quiet for a moment. "She have anyone?" he asked. "No family here. Came from Amarillo with Thomas. Doesn't have the money to leave. Doesn't have anyone to help her go." Mrs. Beaumont shook her head. "It's a cruel world, Mr. Cord." Elias finally turned from the window and looked at the old woman with those dark, calculating eyes. "It doesn't have to stay that way," he said. Mrs. Beaumont didn't quite know what to make of that. She left the coffee and went back downstairs, and for a long time afterward she wondered if she'd imagined a certain coldness in his voice, not cruelty, but something harder and older than cruelty. Purpose. That night, Elias Cord didn't sleep. He sat at his window until the last lamp in Redstone Flats went dark, writing in his journal, occasionally glancing down at the empty street. Calculating something in the dark that no one else in the whole town could yet see. And in the small laundry house at the edge of town, Clara Whitmore pressed a cold cloth to a bruise on her collarbone, and told herself, the way she did every night, that tomorrow she would find a way out. She had been telling herself that for 6 months. She didn't know yet that the way out had just arrived in town on a black horse and taken a room at the Dust Horn Hotel. By the end of his first week, Elias Cord had done something unusual for a man of his apparent wealth and position. He had made himself ordinary. Not invisible. A man like Elias could never be entirely invisible. But he ate his meals at the common table in the hotel dining room rather than having them brought upstairs. He sat at the bar in the Silver Creek Saloon in the evenings and nursed a single whiskey for 2 hours. He asked questions that sounded like small talk but weren't, the kind of questions a careful man asks when he's building a map of a place inside his head. He learned things quickly. He learned that Sheriff Roy Harlan was 61 years old, had bad knees, and owed the Cutter family a significant gambling debt that he'd never be able to repay on a lawman's salary. He learned that Dale Cutter's father, Edmund Cutter, was 73, largely bedridden now, and had perhaps 2 or 3 good months left in him, which meant Dale was about to inherit everything. He learned that the town's only lawyer, a thin, nervous man named Prescott, had drafted documents 2 months ago at Dale's request, documents that Prescott would not discuss but that had left him visibly uncomfortable. And he learned about Thomas Whitmore. Thomas had been, by every account, a genuinely decent man, gentle, hard-working, loved by the hands who worked under him on the Cutter Ranch. He'd met Clara in Amarillo 4 years ago and married her against his family's wishes, because the Cutter family had wanted him to marry the daughter of a neighboring ranching family for the land it would consolidate. Thomas had chosen love over land. Dale had never forgiven him for it. And when Thomas died on the cattle drive, of fever, officially, 3 of the 4 men who had been with him on that drive had quietly left the territory within a month of returning. The fourth, a young hand named Bobby Rees, had stayed because he had nowhere else to go and because he was 19 years old and didn't fully understand yet what he knew. Elias found Bobby Rees on a Thursday afternoon, shoveling manure behind the livery stable, and he sat on a fence post nearby and said nothing for a long moment. Bobby kept working, pretending not to notice the well-dressed stranger. "Thomas Whitmore," Elias said finally, the way a man says the name of a ghost. Bobby's shovel stopped. "I didn't know him," Elias continued, "but I've heard he was a good man." Bobby turned slowly. He was a slight kid with sunburned skin and old eyes for his age. "He was," he said carefully. "How'd a healthy man catch a fever strong enough to kill him that fast?" Elias asked. Not accusatory. Conversational. The tone of a man asking about the weather. Bobby was quiet for a long time. Long enough that the silence itself became an answer. "Those things happen on the trail," Bobby said finally, the words coming out practiced and flat, like something he'd rehearsed. Elias nodded slowly. "They do," he agreed. "Dale Cutter was on that drive too, wasn't he?" Bobby didn't answer. He picked up his shovel and went back to work, but his hands weren't quite steady. Elias climbed down from the fence post and adjusted his coat. "Son," he said quietly, "I'm not the law. And I'm not your enemy. But I think you've been carrying something heavy for a long time, and I think it's getting heavier." He paused. "My room is number 4 at the Dust Horn. There's no obligation. Just if the weight gets too much." He walked away without looking back. He knew Bobby would come. Not today. Maybe not tomorrow. But the boy would come, because guilt is patient but it is not permanent, and when it finally cracks, it cracks toward whoever offered a door. Meanwhile, Elias turned his attention to Prescott the lawyer. He found him at his office above the dry goods store and introduced himself with a business card that carried the name of a land investment firm in Santa Fe, real, verifiable, substantial. Prescott's nervous eyes lit up slightly with the combination of professional interest and financial hope that Elias had learned to recognize as the universal language of a man who needed money. They talked for an hour about land acquisition in the territory. Elias was knowledgeable, specific, credible. Then, near the end, as if it were an afterthought, "I heard there's a widow in town with some property questions. Whitmore, I think the name was." Prescott's expression changed. Just slightly. A tightening around the eyes. "I'm not able to discuss other clients," Prescott said. "Of course not." Elias stood and offered his hand. "I only ask because if there's any contested property in the area, it affects acquisition. Bad title clouds everything downstream, as you know." Prescott shook his hand. His grip was weak and damp. "The Whitmore matter is being resolved," Prescott said, with the careful tone of a man trying to sound confident about something that made him feel sick. "Good," said Elias pleasantly. "Good." He went back to his room that evening and opened his journal and wrote for a long time. Below, in the street, Dale Cutter walked out of the saloon and toward Clara's laundry house, not with any great hurry, the way a man moves towards something he believes already belongs to him. Elias watched from the window. He wrote, "The documents Prescott drafted are almost certainly a property transfer, possibly a forced marriage contract, or a lien against the laundry house. Dale is moving faster than I expected. The father must be failing. I have perhaps 2 weeks. Maybe less." He closed the journal. 2 weeks. He had come to Redstone Flats with a plan that had been careful and slow. Now he was going to have to make it faster. And faster meant riskier. And risk, in a town owned by the Cutter family, meant that before this was over, blood was likely going to touch the dust of this street. The only question was whose. Clara Whitmore had learned to distrust kindness. Kindness in Redstone Flats came with a price attached, always. The woman at the general store who sometimes gave her credit smiled too wide and whispered to her neighbors. The preacher who offered prayers at Thomas's funeral had turned away 3 days later when Dale first grabbed her arm in public. Even Mrs. Beaumont, who was genuinely warm, couldn't resist the particular cruelty of pity, looking at Clara the way you look at something wounded that probably won't survive. So when the stranger knocked on the door of her laundry house on a Friday morning and introduced himself as Elias Cord, Clara's first instinct was to keep the door half closed, and her expression half blank. "I need laundry done," he said simply. No elaborate greeting. No unnecessary charm. He held out a cloth bundle of shirts and trousers, and he looked at her directly, not in the way Dale looked at her, which was proprietary and cold, but in the way a person looks at another person when they've actually decided to see them. It was the directness that unsettled her most. She wasn't used to it. "I charge 8 cents per garment," she said. "That's fine," he said, and handed over the bundle. She expected him to linger. Men often did, sometimes for conversation, sometimes for other reasons she'd learned to shut down fast. But Elias Cord just nodded once and turned to go. "Day after tomorrow would be appreciated, if it suits you," he said over his shoulder. "No rush if it doesn't." He was halfway down the narrow path before she called after him, not entirely sure why she did. "Mr. Cord?" He stopped. "Why are you staying in Redstone Flats?" He turned and looked at her for a moment with those dark eyes that gave nothing away and took everything in. "Land business," he said. She watched him walk away and felt, with some irritation, that he was lying, not maliciously, but deliberately, the way a person lies when the truth is something they're not ready to give yet. She did his laundry that afternoon. His shirts were fine cotton, expensive, and someone had already taken good care of them before her. They weren't dirty so much as trail dusty. One of the shirts had a small blood stain near the cuff, old and faint, the kind that takes patience to remove completely. She removed it. He came back 2 days later, on Sunday, and paid without counting the coins first, which meant he trusted her accounting, or didn't particularly care about the money. Both possibilities said something about him. "Good work," he said, examining a shirt briefly. Then, "Mrs. Whitmore, I know this isn't my business, you're right," she said immediately. "It isn't." He accepted that with a small nod. "I'd like to make it my business, with your permission. I don't know you." "No. But I know enough about your situation to know you need someone in your corner who isn't afraid of Dale Cutter." The name hit the air between them and stayed there. Clara's expression didn't crack. She had practiced not cracking. "And you're not afraid of him?" "No." The word was so simple and so absolutely certain that she almost believed it despite herself. "Why would you help me?" she asked. "What do you want?" "Nothing that would cost you anything," he said. "I want the truth about Thomas's death." "And I think you know more than you've said?" The air in the small laundry house went suddenly thick and careful. Clara set down the shirt she was folding. When she looked at him this time, it was different, the way you look at someone when you're deciding whether to trust them with something that could get you killed. "Thomas didn't die of fever," she said very quietly. "I know," Elias said. "How?" "Because 3 men left the territory within 30 days of coming back from that drive. Men don't run from a fever that's already over." She was quiet for a long time. The iron stove in the corner of the room ticked in the heat. "Dale was there," she said. "On the drive. He and Thomas fought, about me, about the property, about everything. 2 of the hands told me privately, before they left. Thomas was fine at the river crossing. By the next morning he was dead." She paused. "They said Dale gave him water from a separate canteen." "Just Thomas." Elias was very still. "You haven't told the sheriff." "The sheriff works for the Cutter family," she said with a bitterness that wasn't hot but cold, the kind that comes from months of swallowing it. "The only person who might listen is a circuit judge, and the next circuit is 4 months away. By then—" She stopped. "By then Edmund Cutter will be dead." Elias finished. And Dale will have whatever legal document Prescott drew up turned into reality. Whatever that document says. She looked at him sharply. You know about that? I know it exists. I don't know what it says yet. Clara sat down on the edge of the washboard bench, suddenly looking very tired. Dale told me 3 weeks ago that when his father dies, I'll have a choice. Sign the laundry house over to the family, Thomas's share of the estate, which Dale says includes this building, or become his wife. She said the last 2 words like they tasted like ash. He said in this territory, the law favors blood relations in estate disputes. He said Prescott confirmed it. Prescott confirmed what Dale told him to confirm, Elias said. That's not what the law says. Clara looked up at him. I've spent 20 years in land law and estate work across 5 territories, Elias said. Dale Cutter is using fear and isolation to make you believe you have no options. You have options. She studied him for a long moment. And you're going to help me find them. If you'll let me. Why? She asked again, because the question hadn't been answered, not really. Elias picked up his bundle of clean laundry. He was quiet for a long moment, and she saw something move across his face, not calculation this time, but something older and more human. I had a sister, he said finally. Long time ago. Different town, different man, same story. He paused. I was too young to do anything about it then. He wasn't young anymore. He left without another word, and Clara sat in the heat of her laundry house with her hands in her lap, and felt something she hadn't felt in 6 months. Not hope exactly. Something more dangerous than hope. The feeling that maybe, someone was finally standing on the right side of this. She didn't know yet what that would cost either of them. Bobby Rees came to room 4 of the Dusthorn Hotel on a Monday night, just after 10 o'clock, when the saloon noise from down the street was loud enough to cover the sound of boots on the staircase. He knocked 3 times, quickly, and when Elias opened the door the boy looked like he hadn't slept well in 6 months, which he probably hadn't. Elias let him in without a word and poured him a glass of water, which Bobby accepted with both hands. I'm not testifying to anything, Bobby said immediately. I want you to know that up front. I've got nowhere to go and no money, and if Dale finds out I talked, I'm not asking you to testify, Elias said calmly. Sit down, Bobby. The boy sat on the edge of the bed, still holding his water glass. His knee bounced. Just tell me what happened, Elias said. Just to me. In this room. Nothing leaves here without your say-so. Bobby looked at him for a long time, weighing something. Then he started talking. It came out in pieces at first, the way difficult truths often do. Not in a clean narrative, but in fragments that the speaker keeps hoping will somehow add up to something less terrible than they know they add up to. Thomas Whitmore had been healthy when the drive reached the Red Fork River crossing on the 3rd day out. That evening, there had been a fight, not physical, but loud enough that everyone in camp heard it. Dale and Thomas, arguing about the estate, about Clara. About the fact that their father was dying and Thomas had married outside the family's wishes, and Dale intended to correct what he called the imbalance when the time came. Thomas had told Dale flatly that Clara was his wife, that what was his was hers, and that Dale could take his correction and go straight to hell. That night, around the fire, Dale had passed a canteen to Thomas specifically. Made a point of it, said it was good spring water he'd filled separate from the river in case the river water turned. Thomas, not a suspicious man by nature, had drunk from it. By dawn he was cramping and fevered. By midday he was incoherent. By the following morning he was dead. The other men, Bobby said, voice barely above a whisper. They knew. I knew. But Dale looked at us at the burial, and he said the trail is hard and fever is nobody's fault. And that a man who said otherwise would have a very difficult time in this territory. He swallowed. He didn't say it like a threat. He said it like a fact. And it was. It was just a fact. Elias was quiet for a moment. You said 3 other men left the territory. He continued carefully. Do you know where any of them went? Hector Vega went to Tucson. Least that's what I heard. Bobby looked at the floor. The other 2 I don't know. Hector Vega, Elias repeated, and wrote the name in his journal without looking down. What are you going to do? Bobby asked. I'm going to make sure Dale Cutter faces what he's done, Elias said. But not the way you're thinking. I'm not going to ask you to stand up in front of a sheriff who's on the Cutter payroll. What I'm going to do is remove the Cutter family's power over this town by removing the legal and financial structures they depend on. He paused. Dale thinks his strength comes from his father's money and his father's name. When the right people from outside this territory become interested in the Cutter estate, and they will, very soon, things will shift. Bobby looked at him. You're a lawyer? Among other things. The other things? Bobby said slowly. Are they legal? Elias considered this with a slight, complicated expression. Mostly, he said. Bobby almost smiled. It was a grim almost smile, but it was something. He left an hour later, slipping back down the staircase and into the dark street. Elias watched from the window until the boy's slight figure disappeared around the corner of the blacksmith's, then turned back to his journal. He had what he needed from Bobby. But testimony from a 19-year-old ranch hand with no money and no standing would never be enough on its own, not here, not against the Cutter name. What he needed was to make this bigger than Redstone Flats. Big enough that the kind of justice that could actually stick came from somewhere Dale Cutter couldn't reach. He had already, 2 weeks before arriving in town, sent letters to the Territorial Land Office in Santa Fe detailing certain irregularities in the Cutter estate filings he had obtained through connections that had cost him considerably but had been worth every cent. He had sent a second letter to a federal circuit judge named Albright, whom he knew personally, flagging Redstone Flats as a jurisdiction with a documented pattern of estate manipulation. And he had sent a third letter, perhaps the most important one, to a newspaper editor in El Paso who had built a career on exactly the kind of story that was unfolding in this small, shuttered, willfully blind town. The machinery was in motion. But machinery takes time. And time was the one thing he was running short of. Because that evening, from his window, he had seen something new. Dale Cutter, leaving the Dust Horn Bar after 3 whiskeys, had stopped in the street and looked up, directly at Elias's window. Not a casual glance. A long, deliberate look, the kind that said a man had been thinking about something and had arrived at a conclusion. Dale knew Elias was watching. And Dale was the kind of man who responded to observation the way cornered animals respond to any enclosure, with aggression, and without warning. Elias pulled the window shade and sat in the near dark, and for the first time since arriving in Redstone Flats, he allowed himself to feel the particular weight of what happened when careful plans met impatient men. He reached under the bed and checked the revolver he kept there. It was loaded. He hoped he wouldn't need it. He was fairly certain that hope was going to be disappointed. Edmund Cutter died on a Wednesday, just before dawn, while Redstone Flats was still wrapped in the peculiar silence of a desert town before the roosters start and the heat begins its daily assault. By noon, every person in town knew. By 2 in the afternoon, Dale Cutter was sitting in Prescott's office upstairs above the dry goods store. And Prescott was laying documents across the desk with the expression of a man performing a ceremony he found deeply unpleasant but could not refuse. Elias knew all of this because Mrs. Beaumont, who was the town's most efficient unofficial information system, told him at lunch with the particular satisfaction of someone reporting news they consider themselves the first to deliver. He ate his food and thanked her, and went upstairs to his room and stood at the window for exactly 11 minutes doing nothing, the way a man stands when he's recalculating in real time. Edmund's death accelerated everything. Dale would now move quickly. Within days, perhaps within hours, he would present Clara with the documents, and an ultimatum: sign the laundry house over or accept his proposal, and either way she was cornered. And without the letters he'd sent having had time to produce visible results, without the circuit judge having arrived, without the newspaper story having run, Elias's careful long-game strategy had one enormous problem. It was too slow. He picked up his coat and his hat and went to find Clara. She was at the laundry house, as always. But when he arrived, she was standing outside the door, not inside it. Holding herself with her arms crossed over her chest in the specific way of someone who has just received very bad news and is deciding whether to fall apart or stay together. She stayed together. She always stayed together. It was one of the things about her that made him feel something he hadn't felt in a long time, a specific, uncomplicated kind of respect. "You hurt?" she said. "Yes." He stood beside her in the thin afternoon shadow of the building's overhang. "How long before he comes to you?" "Prescott sent word already," she said. "Tomorrow morning. Dale wants to see me at the Cutter house at 8 o'clock. She said it without drama, just flat and steady. "He'll have the papers." Elias breathed slowly. "Clara." He used her first name for the first time. She noticed but didn't comment. "I have to tell you something, and I need you to hear all of it before you respond." She looked at him. "The letters I sent to Santa Fe and to the circuit judge, they're real, and they will produce results. But not by tomorrow morning. Not by this week." He held her gaze. "Which means that if you walk into that meeting alone, you will be walking in without the legal protection I intended to have in place first. So what do I do?" He was quiet for precisely long enough that she read the shape of what he was about to say. Before he said it, "No," she said immediately. "Clara, you're going to suggest that I marry you first," she said, and her voice had gone sharp and hard. "So that Dale's legal claim is voided." A living husband supersedes a dead one's brother in estate law. "Yes," Elias said simply. "We've spoken perhaps 10 times total. I know. You are essentially a stranger. I know that too." She stared at him. "And you think I should trust you, a man I barely know, over this? I think," he said carefully, "that you should consider that Dale Cutter is the alternative. And that a marriage to me would be, from a legal standpoint, protective, with whatever other terms you set." He paused. "I'm not asking you to feel anything. I'm asking you to be safe. That's what men say right before they stop letting you be safe," she said. And it was such an honest and devastating thing to say, the kind of thing that comes from months of being given no reason to trust anyone, that Elias felt it somewhere real. "I know," he said quietly. "I know why you'd think that. And I can't prove otherwise by talking. I can only tell you that the alternative, tomorrow morning, alone, with Dale and those papers, is worse." The silence between them was long and full of the sound of the desert, wind, a distant horse, the creak of the blacksmith's sign. "What about what you said?" she asked finally. "About Thomas." "That Dale, Bobby Reese talked to me," Elias said. "And I have a name in Tucson, Hector Vega, who was on that drive. If I can get a letter to him and bring him back to testify before Judge Albright, that's a lot of ifs," Clara said. "Yes." She closed her eyes for a moment. When she opened them, they were clear and steady and decided. "If I do this," she said, "you do not speak for me. You do not make decisions for me. You do not treat this house as yours." "Agreed. And you tell me everything. Every letter you've sent, every plan you've made, every person you've talked to. No more operating in the shadows while I'm kept ignorant." "Agreed," he said again, without hesitation. She studied him one more time, this scarred, deliberate, complicated man who had watched her for weeks from a hotel window and apparently decided her life was worth rearranging his own for. "Why?" she asked. Just the one word again. The same question she'd asked before. This time, he didn't mention his sister. He just said quietly and without artifice, "Because it's the right thing." And I've spent too much of my life doing the careful thing instead. That night, the town's justice of the peace, an old man named Garvey who owed Elias nothing and feared Dale only moderately, married Elias Cord and Clara Whitmore by lamplight in the back room of the Dust Horn Hotel. Mrs. Beaumont was the witness. She cried. In the morning, Dale Cutter would arrive at Prescott's and Prescott would tell him. And everything in Redstone Flats would either come apart or come together, depending on which side of the ledger you were standing on. Dale Cutter's face, when Prescott told him, was a study in the specific ugliness of a man who has just discovered that the thing he believed he owned has been taken from him by paperwork, which is the only kind of taking that truly enrages men who use paperwork as weapons. He didn't shout. Men like Dale rarely shouted when they were truly dangerous. He sat very still in Prescott's chair for a long moment, and then he stood, and he buttoned his coat, and he said, "That marriage isn't legal." Prescott, sweating through his collar, said that it was, in fact, entirely legal. Justice Garvey was a credentialed officer of the court. The paperwork was filed and recorded. Dale said nothing else. He walked out. Prescott immediately sent a note to Elias. Elias received it at the Dust Horn and read it, and set it down and looked at Clara, who was sitting across from him at the small table in his room where they had eaten breakfast together in the careful, slightly strange way of two people who are married in the legal sense, and almost strangers in every other. "He'll come here," Elias said. Not alarmed. Factual. "I know," Clara said. "Or he'll come to you when you're alone." "I won't be alone," she said, and there was steel in it. Elias looked at her. "No," he agreed. "You won't." Dale came that afternoon. Not to the hotel. To the laundry house, where Clara had insisted on going to work because surrender wasn't in her nature, and she refused to spend her first day as a married woman hiding in a hotel room. Elias walked her there and took a position in the feed store across the narrow street, visible through the open doorway, which meant anyone approaching the laundry house from the front would see him. Dale came from the back. Clara heard the door open and turned, and Dale was already inside, and the look on his face was something past anger. It had gone somewhere quieter and more absolute. "You think a piece of paper changes anything?" he said. Clara stood her ground. "Yes," she said. "That's exactly what I think. That man doesn't know you. He doesn't know this town." Dale took one slow step toward her. "He'll be gone in a month. Men like that, they pass through. And when he's gone, you'll still be here. And I'll still be here. I won't be here alone." Clara said again, same steel. "You can't hide behind a stranger forever." "I'm not hiding," she said. "For the first time in 6 months, I'm not hiding at all." Dale reached out and grabbed her arm, the same grip he'd used dozens of times before. The grip that said you don't have choices, and Clara didn't pull back. She looked at him without flinching. And then the back door opened wider. Elias stood in it. He must have gone around the back of the building while Dale was coming through the front, anticipated the move, or guessed it, or simply knew that a man like Dale would try to catch her alone. He stood in the doorway with his hands open at his sides, no weapon visible, and looked at Dale with an expression that was entirely without anger. Something far more frightening, patience. "Let go of her arm," Elias said. Dale turned. He was nearly as large as Elias, and he had the particular confidence of a man who had always been the most powerful person in any room in his home territory. "You've made a serious mistake, Cord," he said. "You don't know who you're, Dale Cutter," Elias said. "Son of Edmund Cutter, deceased as of yesterday morning. You have approximately 14,000 acres of cattle land, a controlling interest in the Redstone Flats Bank, and a legal arrangement with Sheriff Harlan that includes clearing a debt of $900 in exchange for selective law enforcement." He paused. "I also know what happened at the Red Fork River crossing on the 5th of April this year. With Thomas. And so does a man named Hector Vega, who I spoke with by telegraph 3 days ago, and who has agreed to make a signed statement to Circuit Judge Albright, who arrives in this territory in 11 days. The room went very still. Dale's grip on Clara's arm had gone loose without him noticing. She stepped back. He didn't follow. "You're bluffing," Dale said. But the word came out uncertain, which meant he wasn't sure. "Thomas Whitmore didn't die of fever," Elias said, quietly and clearly. "And I can prove it with 2 witnesses. Documentary inconsistencies in the death report filed by the trail boss, who you paid, and a toxicological analysis performed on samples of the canteen residue that Bobby Reese kept." He watched Dale's face. "Bobby kept it. All this time, he kept it in a jar under his bunk. Because he was 19 years old and scared. But he wasn't so scared that he could bring himself to throw away the last evidence of what you did to a good man." Dale said nothing. The silence in the laundry house was the loudest thing Clara had ever heard. "Here's what happens next," Elias said. "You will sign over to Clara Whitmore Court her full legal claim to this property and Thomas's share of the Cutter estate, which your father's original will, filed in Santa Fe 14 years ago and never properly superseded, designates as 1/6 of the total holdings. You will do this with Prescott as witness, and you will do it before Friday. In exchange, the materials regarding Thomas's death will be held by Judge Albright under seal and not pursued criminally. So long as there are no further incidents involving Clara or anyone connected to her." He paused one final time. "Or you can refuse, and I will hand every piece of evidence I have to the judge upon arrival. And you will spend the rest of your life learning what happens to wealthy men when the territory finally decides to stop protecting them." Dale looked at him for a long time. Then he looked at Clara. She met his eyes without a single tremor. Something moved across Dale Cutter's broad, cruel face, something that wasn't quite defeat and wasn't quite rage, but was the specific, nauseating realization of a man who has run his whole life on the assumption that he was owed things, discovering that the universe has finally, irrevocably, stopped agreeing with him. He walked out. He didn't look back. 3 days later, on a Friday morning, with Prescott as witness and his hand barely steady on the pen, Dale Cutter signed the papers. He left Redstone Flats 4 days after that. Not run out of town, he still owned the ranch, still had his name and his land. But the particular power he had held over one woman, over one small laundry house, over one story he had told himself about what he was owed, that was gone. And gone, it turned out, was enough. Judge Albright arrived 11 days later, as promised. The sealed materials on Thomas Whitmore's death went into the federal record. Not prosecuted, the deal held. But documented. Permanent. The kind of truth that, once written down in the right place, doesn't disappear even when powerful men wish it would. Hector Vega came back from Tucson and gave his statement, and went back again, and Bobby Reese slept better after that. Not perfectly, but better. Sheriff Harlan retired within the month. The new sheriff was younger, and had no debts to the Cutter family. The newspaper story ran in El Paso in October. It didn't name Dale explicitly, the legal arrangement precluded that, but it told the story of Redstone Flats in broad strokes. The way stories about small towns and corrupted power always tell themselves, and people who knew Redstone Flats knew exactly what they were reading. Clara kept the laundry house. She hired a girl from town to help her. A young Mexican woman named Rosaria who needed work and was grateful for it, and who turned out to have a sharp head for numbers and an even sharper eye for quality. Within a year, the laundry house had expanded into a proper commercial cleaning and textile business. Clara didn't think about Thomas every day anymore. She thought about him often, always with love, always with grief, always with the particular ache of something interrupted before its time. But not every day. Elias stayed in Redstone Flats. That surprised people. They had expected him to take his business wins and move on, That's what men like that did, wasn't it? They passed through. They solved things and moved on. But he stayed. He and Clara were married in the legal document sense, and then, slowly, imperfectly, in all the other senses too. Not quickly. Not smoothly. There were weeks where they were strangers who happened to share a town. And there were arguments born from the friction of two people who had both survived difficult things and carried the habits of that survival into every room they entered. Clara didn't trust easily. Elias didn't explain himself easily. They were, in some fundamental way, very alike, both people who had learned that caution was the price of staying whole. But he brought her coffee in the mornings without being asked. And she laughed at something he said one October evening, genuinely and without reservation, and it was the first time he had heard her laugh, and it hit him somewhere he hadn't expected. And there were mornings when she woke before him and watched him sleep with an expression she didn't entirely understand and wasn't entirely sure she needed to. It wasn't a fairy tale. It was something more durable than a fairy tale. The night before the first anniversary of Edmund Cutter's death, which was also, roughly, the anniversary of the marriage, Elias found the old journal in the bottom of his leather satchel while looking for something else. He sat at the window of what was now their room in the Dust Horn. They'd moved to the ground floor, closer to the street. Because Clara said she didn't like feeling above things, and he opened it to the first entry. He'd written, "A woman knelt in the dust of the main street and gathered other people's clean laundry from the ground while a dozen people found reasons to look elsewhere." He read it twice. Then he turned to the back of the journal, to a blank page, and wrote one final entry. Some things you have to be willing to do something about. Not because the outcome is guaranteed. Not because you'll be thanked. Not even because you're certain you're right. But because the alternative, sitting at a window, watching, is a kind of death that doesn't have the decency to look like dying. He closed the journal. Outside, the lights of Redstone Flats were going dark one by one, the way they did every night, and the desert beyond the town was vast and black and patient and indifferent. The way deserts always are. Inside, somewhere in the building, Clara was humming something quiet and low to herself in the way she did when she thought no one was listening. Elias sat and listened. And the question that remained, the one that would follow this story wherever it traveled, wasn't whether what he did was right, or legal, or clean. It was simpler and harder than that. When you see something that should not be allowed to continue, when you sit at your window and you watch and you know, at what point does watching become its own kind of crime? Redstone Flats never quite answered that. Neither did Elias Cord. But he stopped watching. And maybe that was enough. Maybe that was everything.